Okay, guys, this is not ideal because obviously I'd much rather be with you when I teach you how to annotate poetry, but I'm going to take this video just to at least give you a first crack at it. As we discussed last week in class, the first way to approach a poem is to experience it, right? Read it out loud, see what it looks like on the page, see what sort of thoughts, feelings, ideas, connections it brings up in your head. But now I'm going to give you a step-by-step way to approach analyzing a poem once you've done that first experiential reading. Okay, so the first thing you should do is you should box off the title. Okay, and the reason why is because you want to think about the relationship between the title and the poem itself. Now, all of these first few steps are things that you can do mindlessly, making that little box around the title right here. The second thing is going to be numbering the lines. This is because whenever you refer to the poem, you are going to be citing line numbers as your evidence. Okay, the next thing that you are going to do after you've numbered the lines is you are going to bracket the stanzas. Now remember, stanzas are the little rooms of the poem. They are sort of like the poem's version of a paragraph, and they're grouped together visually on the page. Okay? Now we're going to see a couple of things. First of all, this poem, I'm scanning the end of these lines, and I'm seeing that there is something of a rhyme scheme here, okay? So I'm going to label them. Now, if you remember, labeling rhyme schemes, you just alternate A, B, C, and keep on going in the alphabet. Here we have drizzle is A, snow would be B because they don't rhyme. Invisible, you have the LE. It's not a perfect rhyme, but this is a slant rhyme. So we're gonna label this A. And slow does rhyme with snow, so that's B. And then these two don't rhyme with any of these up here, but they rhyme with each other, so it's C, C. And this is called a rhyming couplet. Okay, again, we're not saying anything about the form, just marking what the form is, not what it means. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, and this is, I think, the last thing before we start thinking about what the poem is saying, is we're going to follow syntax. And what does that mean? It just means literally we're going to find the sentences and see if they're complete, if they run on for a long time, if they're fragmentary, what's the verb, what's the subject, what's the object, etc., etc. So we're going to look for punctuation marks. Okay, so this is one sentence. This is another sentence, and then this is another sentence. Okay. And it really doesn't matter what kind of key you come up with to mark these things. This is just sort of what I'm doing. But as long as you're consistent and can make sense of what you're doing, then you're going to be in a good place. Okay, now that I've done that, I'm going to read the poem again, and now all I'm doing is I'm underlining things that jump out at me. Okay. So I'm just going to switch colors because that's going to draw my eye. Okay. Sparrows were feeding in a freezing drizzle. The wall you watched turned to pieces of snow, riding a gradient invisible, from silver aslant to random white and slow. Okay, I like this phrase, gradient invisible. I want to know, what does that mean? Feeding in a freezing drizzle. That while you watch turn to pieces of snow. So feeding and freezing, that's alliteration, but while you watch turn to pieces of snow, that's called consonants. Riding a gradient invisible from silver aslant to random white and slow. There came a moment that you couldn't tell. and then they clearly flew instead of fell. Okay, alliteration here. Okay, so the next question I'm going to ask myself is, what is the plot or a summary? What's the point of view, and who are the characters? Okay, and I'm going to look at all the things that I've marked to see if I can have some clues about what's going on here. So characters, we have the sparrows. Should we say the snow is a character? I don't know. There's a U. Oop, I gotta move my camera back. Hold on. Okay, and then there's the narrator or poet. In poetry, we call them either the poet or the speaker. Okay, and these are the beings that are in the poem. So whose point of view is it from? Well, is it in the second person? I don't know. It's a little unclear, right? Now, we're going to go back to that title because you asked about the line between prose and poetry. So there seems to be an I, okay? And the I seems to be responding to the you. And so we have to think about, is this you who's asking the question the same as this you in the poem? Okay, so then what can we say is a plot summary of what's going on? Sparrows. We're eating in the snow. You are watching the snow rises. Okay. So this is sort of the beginning of the end of our information collecting. Now we're going to say themes. And actually, in fact, I'll switch colors. Because themes are what's going to help us connect observations we make and claims we make about those observations and what they might mean, and think about other parts that they connect to in the poem, or just these larger ideas, why they matter or are significant. Okay, so what are some themes in the poem? Well, it seems to be, number one, prose and poetry. Okay, because that's in the title. So we're going to look at how writing might surface here in the poem. There's also this idea of observing. And then I'm going to look here at this couplet. Usually couplets give us, a last idea to think about, some last impression that we're supposed to walk away with. And the fact that this final couplet rhymes further unifies it together. So we should think about it as a piece in relation to what's going on up here, okay? There came a moment that you couldn't tell, and then they clearly flew instead of fell. So flying and falling, those are two verbs here. Falling seems to have no control, right? It's a sort of letting go of control or not ever having control. Just sort of, you are an object to be acted upon. Flying, however, is different, right? Flying, there is agency there. There's a being that is acting. Now, here it's complicated because it's not the birds flying, those would be beings flying, but it's the snow, which isn't really an agent, but it seems to have agency when this gradient invisible, which is the wind, acts upon it. Okay? So, when I say agency, I mean like ability to act. Or will, ability or will to act. Versus being acted on. Now, how can we relate this to poetry? Well, I'm going to think about writing poetry, but I'm also going to think about reading poetry. And if I think about writing and reading and poetry, it makes me think of something like inspiration and also like feeling moved. You know, as a writer, you can sit down and write, but unless you feel moved by something, it might feel mechanical. The same thing is true of reading. If you don't feel moved by what you're reading, it can feel like you're just kind of going through the motions. But the moment that that wind picks up, something magical seems to happen. Now, we can go back to the poem's title, because you asked about the line between prose and poetry, and think about, this is a because. This poem right here is an answer. Somebody asked the poet about the line between prose and poetry, and this is the poet's response. So, I would say that what might happen here in between these two stanzas, where what happens is the line between prose and poetry happens. It's in the not telling. Sparrows were feeding in a freezing drizzle, that while you watched turned to pieces of snow, riding a gradient invisible, from silver aslant to random white and slow. It's turning, the snow here being carried by the wind is turning from silver to white. There came a moment that you couldn't tell, and then they, meaning the pieces of snow, clearly flew instead of fell. We lose the sparrows here. We think that we're watching the sparrows, but actually what we're watching is the freezing drizzle. We're watching these invisible forces. Invisible forces. Can I list them? Wind, cold, time, these things that have a tremendous impact on everything in the poem, but yet are invisible. And we only see them through their effects. And so what I think is happening is, I think what the poet is telling us, or showing us rather, is that in this, the moment where you couldn't tell, the unknowingness, the lack of clarity, because I'm disoriented and can't exactly say what's happening as clearly as it is here. Sparrows feeding in a freezing drizzle. Here it becomes unclear. The they seems like it's the sparrows, but it's actually not. It's the pieces of snow. And it's only in going back and piecing that together that we figure that out. But in this moment where there's a lack of clarity, that's where the poetry happens. That's the line between poetry and prose. It is being in a moment that is true and real and being fully present and letting it just be. And that's how you annotate a poem.